Weapons rocked my world. Zach Cregger, director of the seedy Airbnb basement horror film that was a critique against Reaganomics, Barbarian, and former member of the comedy troupe The Whitest Kids You Know, has crafted a horror epic that's been compared to Magnolia, sprawling and overwhelming in scale, following multiple characters over multiple chapters in one town through one interconnected story about one town all reeling after the disappearance of 17 children walking out of their homes randomly at 2:17 a.m. one morning, and they all happen to be from the same classroom. And we as an audience couldn't help ourselves but let our imaginations run wild with the viral marketing for this film, asking ourselves, why are these kids Naruto running? Where could they be going? Why is this man throwing up black goo in the trailer? Who is running out into traffic? Why is any of this happening? And more importantly, what is Zach Cregger trying to say here? And some of our theories and speculations going into the film were right, and I think a whole lot of it was wrong when guessing the mystery of weapons, and how I think this film all ties back into being about the modern day witch hunt. My name is James, this is Movie Good or Movie Bad. I'm not here to change your opinion, I'm just here to share mine. The movie just came out, I'll have seen it multiple times by the time you're seeing this video. I don't think there's one definitive interpretation for this film. Weapons is complex, it's layered, it's dense. There's a whole lot going on here, and by no means am I saying that my opinion is better than other people's. Seriously, when you're going into this film or you want to read, more video essays or just written essays about the film, do read a wide variety of them online, whether they're from people who do like the film, hate the film, love the film, etc. I don't just have the right opinion here. Today I want to touch on how the film blends horror and comedy, what is real and what the film is trying to say, touching on domestic horror, touching on how Zach Cregger's talked about what this film was about for him as a person, what are the weapons and who is using them, the modern day witch hunt, and also the failure that comes after a tragedy, specifically in the case of police and also just parents. And maybe most frightening for me overall, how the horror continues well after the film ends. As you go on and you do enjoy this video, please like, comment, subscribe, hit that bell, or do consider following me on other platforms where I do talk about movies, whether that be Instagram, Letterboxd, or TikTok, where I do post multiple times a day. And to kick things off, let's briefly talk about what exactly is happening here in Weapons. The film is, like I said before, a horror epic in the style of Magnolia, where we follow multiple characters over multiple chapters through the tale of these 17 missing children. The film is broken into 6 different chapters. Most clearly from our trailer, we can tell that our lead here is Justine, the teacher of these missing children, but we also have a chapter that's centered around Archer, a man whose son is now missing, and Paul, a police officer who's currently having an on and off again affair with Justine. But shockingly and less clear from looking at just the trailers, we also have a chapter that follows Marcus, the school principal in the film, James, a homeless man who accidentally finds the children in the basement of the 6th person that we follow, Alex, who is the 18th child in Justine's classroom who doesn't go missing for an at first unknown reason, and a reveal shockingly quick into the film that caused the first of many gasps from my audience. As we sit in the mystery, confusion, and anger of this town, channeled towards Justine for being the teacher of these children and being the focal point of frustration, because to these parents, she had to have known that something was going on. It is actually revealed that Alex's aunt in town is a witch, causing people to enter a trance in the film using blood magic and her magic bell, causing people to enter a zombie-like comatose state, potentially attacking others if commanded to, and leads the children into the basement of the home. Which is really funny that Zach Cregger likes his basements, whether we're thinking about their place in Barbarian, whether we think about the inspiration that a lot of people saw when watching that film and thinking, wow, does Zach Cregger really like Resident Evil 7, or the fact that he really does love the franchise and he's now directing the next film in the franchise, which comes out next year, which I'm so excited for. And bringing it back to these children, Alex's aunt, Gladys, is trying to drain their life force and gain some type of youth, with Alex feeding them and his parents soup in the meantime, while the entire town directs their ire towards the wrong woman, aka they're justified in their witch hunt, but they're just chasing after the wrong woman, which in a way is really, really funny yet sad, and that touches on this balance beam of tone that Zach Cregger has placed himself on when crafting this dense film. There is a natural relationship between comedy and horror, and it goes beyond some of our modern masters of horror and their place in both, whether we're talking about Zach Cregger and Jordan Peele, who both have their starts in comedy and make horror films now, or someone like Ari Aster, who has always believed there's been an element of absurdity in the premises and execution of Hereditary and Midsommar, and follow them up with 2 films leaning into that absurdist humor much more overtly, Beau is Afraid and Eddington, regardless if those 2 films worked for you or not. But no, horror and comedy have a natural relationship because they involve these same ingredients. Speaking through comedic terms, we have the setup and the punchline, or really if you want to think about this much more neutrally, we have the build up to tension and then we have the release or the shock or the surprise. And whether this is humor that exists in a horror film or humor that exists in a comedy or stand-up or sarcasm or whatever, if we shift this back over to horror, we sit in the tension and the moment of a scare before it finally gets you, whether that's a jump scare with or without the sound, And then there's some kind of reveal that breaks the tension as well there, right? This makes the audience afraid, right? The only two differences between both are, sure, there's some shock and surprise, but in one of them you're laughing and the other you're just absolutely terrified. And it's why so many people, when they watch horror films, sometimes they do laugh at these scares that do happen because they're like, oh my god, I was so shocked, I was so surprised. It's why ultimately, if you're a creative person and you're making a movie and you understand what makes a joke funny, you understand what makes a scare scary, it's fairly easy to navigate both the world of horror and comedy, and you can really do it simultaneously if you feel brave enough to. And we also use comedy to navigate our responses to trauma in our lives and deeply unsettling moments in our lives as well, which made me appreciate how willing Zach Cregger was willing to sit in both the worlds of horror and comedy within moments of each other for weapons. And seriously, if you haven't seen the film and you're watching this video, you've seen someone else's review, and you find yourself worried about any of the comedy, because I've seen a lot of those comments online, please do not be alarmed. It never negates from any of the tension or the horror in the film or the weight of the real-life inspiration for the film. Now, it was beyond natural for people to have speculated to the level that they did going into Weapons. The teasers were literally saying to us, what do you see that I don't? Show me. And are you watching? And for as much mystery as there was, when we received that second official trailer on June 23rd of this year, it was natural for us to see an auditorium of parents yelling and screaming and becoming irate at their school teacher Justine, to recognize that this was a group of parents unsure how to process their grief. And while there is no question that their children had been gone for 30 days, there was certainly a question of whether or not these children would come back. And immediately there was two parts of a real-life analog that appeared for me and many others when looking at this image or this scene. Stripping away these supernatural happenings of the film, if I were to think about a scenario where a majority of students in a classroom were to disappear and the teacher were to be blamed, we all thought of a school shooting, right? A tragedy that I'm not taking lightly evoking, and understandably with a title like Weapons, many others had similar thinking going into the film. And also not too shocking to maintain as a train of thought while you're watching the movie, considering that during Archer's dream in the film, he sees a giant floating gun over his house, etched with the glow of an alarm clock saying 2:17, which funnily enough, Zach Cregger said came to him in a vision through transcendental meditation, and like the mystery of dream logic and the random images that float through our mind through a dream, is open to the interpretation of the viewer, especially because it's an image that quite literally means nothing to Cregger. To me, that image meant that anybody can use a weapon at any time, even if we don't recognize it, and I'll talk more about that later when talking about who the weapons are. I will also say the significance of the time in the film is not lost to me, though. Earlier in this film, I mentioned how Zach Cregger was part of the comedy troupe The Whitest Kids You Know, but he also explicitly named this film was birthed to navigate the loss of his friend and Whitest Kids You Know member and local sex pot, Trevor Moore, who passed away sadly on August 7th, 2021, at roughly 2:30 a.m. It's impossible to not only draw parallels to the time of his passing and the children going missing in the film, but also the fact that August 7th is the date of when preview screenings take place for Weapons, meaning that aside from early critic screenings and special events, anyone who goes to see that film during the Thursday preview screenings is going to be seeing the film on the anniversary of Trevor's passing, which was devastating. Trevor will be forever missed, and I don't blame Zach Cregger for not naming any of the other words about his grief other than it was channeled into the film. That is truly something just so therapeutic and cathartic, and I hope that this gave him some form of peace. Going back to the interpretation about school shootings being comparable to the tragedy in the film, although I'm not going to go through the hundreds of school shootings that have taken place in the United States, it's not really that far-fetched if a teacher were to survive and her classroom went missing or passed away, she'd become the focus and target of harassment. And really, don't teachers become the focal point for harassment all the time? Teachers were heroes because they maintained normalcy during COVID and provided structure for children during a very hard time when their parents were also very confused. And then suddenly when children return to school and haven't been reading at home and don't have many attentive parents engaging with them or any of their learning, they're magically testing much worse than before when it came to standardized testing. They're doing much more poorly grade-wise, they're much more delinquent, they're finding themselves isolated and alone, and now that all magically falls back on the teacher. Justine is the most clear of scapegoats in this situation, a woman who is metaphorically burned at the stake and becomes subject to the court of the public and also made guilty without any evidence or proof because these parents have no one else to blame. Archer, in the most on-the-nose display of this, writes witch on the side of Justine's car, further identifying her as a target and the focus of this anger. There is a careful balance between us understanding why these parents are struggling the way that they have and also being terrified for Justine, who is finding herself targeted and followed in many ways, both physical, such as Archer keeping tabs on her, and Gladys and her metaphysical astral projections haunting Justine's dreams. And going back to the line between horror and comedy, for as frightening as Gladys is at times, she also evokes the image of a clown town in her bright and vibrant clothing and makeup, which should either be seen as comedic or frightening depending on the person, and it is wildly funny how much of this film is pointing towards this need for society to find a modern-day witch to blame, and yet, there is a literal witch in this movie. Funnily, the most strange-looking person in the film, and she is avoided in this witch hunt. And that's just even more absurd as you spell it out. Particularly when we shift towards Alex's segment in the film, it made me wonder if Zach Cregger was trying to evoke the themes of domestic horror, or movies in my construction of the subgenre focus on the horror within the home, which usually calls upon a family member to end up being an assailant or the victim of horror. Think a movie like Hereditary, or evokes the ideas of your home, a sanctuary where most people feel safe, becoming the target of violence suddenly, which I really love how that idea is explored in the Japanese slasher from the 80s Door, which follows a mysterious intruder and stalker invading a home and has a wild conclusion. Just as an aside, I cannot recommend this movie enough. It is so underrated. When honing in on weapons as a film though, it's telling the horror is literally within the home of the one child who's been left behind. The fact that there's a woman inside this home, his aunt, who's hypnotized his parents, who's kept all 17 children in the basement in order to drain their life force, who has told Alex that if he tells anyone this at all, she will kill his parents. The horror of this film is always hinted at to be in this one home, whether we're just watching the trailers or just even immediately going into the film. It is never hidden from us as an audience that this one home was the key to it all, but to everyone in the town, no one was really willing to go inside. No one is willing to do the hard work or get the hard answers because all of it is just so upsetting. Police and investigators would not go inside. School administrators would not escalate their investigation. Justine, the one woman in this film who's shown to care in this film no matter what, is chastised for hugging a child when they're sad, driving a student home who'd not been picked up at school. As far as we know, she's the only one who can tell that something very wrong has happened to Alex, and that she wants him to share if anything is happening at home. She is the one who solves all this. Without her, there is no finding these children or ending this madness. To me, looking at this house, or Gladys's presence, or even the conversations Justine has between herself and Alex that seem very comparable to checking in with a child to see if they're experiencing child abuse at home, and the principal intentionally not wanting to have child protective services called on the family. This pretty quickly dismantles the justification of a witch hunt for Justine, but doesn't that implicate everyone else? Sure, Gladys did the spell, sure she's the cause of all this evil in the town, but why did no one else take the necessary steps in solving the case of these missing kids? Why did many of them partake in actions that made these kids gone for much longer, especially when it came to looking deeper inside Alex's home? I think it's personally unfair in some regards for me to point the finger at anyone in some ways due to not being a parent, but I also want to recognize that Zach Cregger has personally said in several interviews that being a parent is one of the scariest things imaginable to him. That's why he doesn't have kids. And in the context of this film, whether these parents are trying to do this or not, I think they all have the best intentions. Isn't there some form of failure that's taking place? And again, not as a form of critique for these parents, how do you confront a witch lady that you don't know is hypnotizing your children while they go out into the darkness in the middle of the night? But I think as we begin to get older, we recognize that everybody around us is just winging it all the time throughout all different aspects of our lives, whether it's work or being a parent. And that extends to the further depths of asking, if you had a child and you had to either explain to them about a tragedy or live with their victimhood being part of a tragedy, would you be able to find the words to describe that horrendous feeling, or would you be stuck trying to make sense of a senseless act while the world around you keeps moving and you're just trying to grieve and you want it all to pause? But that's not sadly the world that any of us live in. None of us have the tools to manage this. None of us have the weapons to rid the evils of the world so easily. Sometimes they approach us without warning and we're left to suffer in the fallout. And it's really easy to draw attention to the parents of the missing children or the missing children themselves, but parenting as a whole is a much bigger part of the movie, including the 2 chapters of the film where people think that the parents are really not all that important in the film. That being Paul's chapter and also James's chapter. Paul is being told by his partner that she is ovulating and is clearly attempting to have a child, which clearly also makes him uneasy, which makes him just easily tempted by Justine, which is an example of Paul pushing away from his role as a parent, something that we see immediately echoed through his on-screen partner James, a man who's clearly struggling with substance abuse and a man living in a tent without a job, caught pawning random items and knickknacks he finds throughout town to make some cash to pay back his mother, who is choosing not to help him at this moment. Although I don't know anything about their relationship, I'm not sure I'd let this guy into my home. And we also have Alex, whose parents seemed loving and caring in the few instances that we spent with them, but if we were to take time and detach them from their possession, they are hollow husks of people who don't respond to their son, live in his home, don't provide him any food, he has to feed them himself, and can't even open up a soup can, and this negligence, while explained by Gladys's possession, is why Justine asks so many questions. It shows how alone Alex was. This was happening for what? weeks, maybe months, and Justine was the only one who knew that nothing was okay at home. Krieger has also spoken about in a recent Hollywood Reporter article how this one chapter about Alex was actually conceived due to his experiences struggling with alcohol and living with a father who died of cirrhosis of the liver. And I think without putting the label of alcoholism here, I think there's a similar relationship that I can gather just watching the film immediately. Everyone in this film is being failed by their guardians, their caregivers, the people who are supposed to take care of them, including the police. Now, I've talked about my thoughts on the police all across the internet. I think you're going to gather what they are here, but Zach Krieger, pretty clearly between Weapons and Barbarian, does not portray them as action heroes or the surveyors of justice that we sometimes see in the films and television that people classify as propaganda. Whether we're thinking about TV shows like Blue Bloods or even Twin Peaks, or thinking about movies like The Batman or Twin Peaks. No, the police and Weapons are deceitful to the people in their lives. They are downplaying reasonable questions about these missing children. They couldn't solve any of the crimes in this town. It's not clear how much time they're investing into any of this at all. Yet it took Archer's bit of persistence and Justine's level of care for these children, and also I guess James's need for cash, to actually find out that they were all inside Alex's home. Police are failures in this film. If we channel this through Paul as a character, he is actively afraid of the homeless. He's actively afraid of a fentanyl overdose or receiving HIV or AIDS. He is violent, he is aggressive, he is deeply disturbing. The bum walks directly into Alex's house and is placed into a trance in the most avoidable way possible in the film. What a failure. Interpretations for what Weapons is may vary wildly, and that is expected with a film as dense as Weapons, but it is clear that the overwhelming feeling of grief is channeled through every single bit and ounce of this film. Going into this film with the school shooting interpretation of the film, I hadn't quite comprehended the fact that I could interpret Weapons as a title and ask the question, who exactly are the weapons? And at some point the children are clearly named as the weapons in the film, being weaponized by Gladys in all sorts of ways, but I also think the grief around them is weaponized. It's used as a justification of the treatment of Justine, rationalizing the horrible actions that make no sense whatsoever, because if these kids are gone, it's okay to treat this poor woman this way, right? It's an understandable and equally inexcusable outlet for that pain, but despite this ending with Gladys gone, is this all really over? The kids are found and Gladys is dead, but what about all the people who died in this journey? Justine has killed both Paul, a man that she clearly was more than attracted to, as well as James. Marcus, the principal, and his husband died in horrific violence and is going to affect their families. The woman that killed Marcus, and also anybody who saw Marcus's bloodied face before his passing and found themselves disturbed. What about Paul's partner? What about Alex, who's going to live with another family because his parents need such assistance that they were never snapped out of this trance? What about the fact that he has his aunt's tree that allowed him to grant magic? What happens if that tree is used for the most nefarious of means and something awful happens again in the future? What about the fact that all these kids were found, but not all of them started talking again? The fact that they were gone for 30 days, the fact that these families experienced a loss and it's negated because these kids came back, but none of them are the same. None of this is a happy ending. They are still all left traumatized or affected by the events of this film, and they might never be the same again. Zach Krieger has said that he intentionally wanted to drop off the film at random or strange places for each of these chapters, making an audience feel disoriented or abandoned, but I can't help but feel the same can be said for grief, that despite all the work that we do to find an answer, despite all the time that passes, none of us are ever the same at the end of the day, none of us ever completely heal. And for some, the explanation that this was all because of a witch will be disappointing or anticlimactic, and while I disagree, can't the same be said for grief overall? Zach, if you somehow see this, I hope making the film again was a cathartic experience, and I just want to say, even though I didn't know Trevor in the same way that you did at all, you two were such an important part of my childhood, and I just really thank you both, and I just want to say that I'm going to really miss him as well. Although the film has only come out a couple of days ago, Weapons has really spoke to me in a way that I can't shake, and that really just speaks to the pervasive nature of grief overall. And that's the case whether a certain image or sound or scare or laugh really affected you or not. Weapons was a masterpiece. I seriously can't wait to see it again. I have already pre-ordered the Steelbook online because I'm that excited about everything that I saw, and I own so many movies. I really don't do that often anymore. Loved it that much. Can't wait to see what Zach Krieger does next. He's already announced a handful of other movies that he's working on. Can't wait to see them all, honestly. This is James. Again, if you enjoyed this video, please like, please comment, please subscribe, hit that bell, and I'm signing off. I'll see you all next time.